Today I'm really pleased to have Anna Grear, who's a senior lecturer in law at Bristol Law School and the head of the International Law and Human Rights Research Unit, as well as the founder and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Human Rights and the Environment. Her research interests are primarily in legal theory and human rights law, and taught courses in those areas like civil liberties, critical and legal reasoning, and human rights courses. She's visited quite a bit, including Oxford, University of Kiel, and Emory before, and is here again for part of this summer with our Center on FLT. So with that, I'll turn things over to Anna Grear. She's presenting Project Mind the Gap, Reflections on Legal Subjectivity in the Age of Globalization.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I have to do the whole glasses thing because otherwise I get completely lost. The chapter that you've been given that you probably haven't had time to read is only background for part of what I'm going to say, so it really doesn't matter if you haven't read it or if you haven't read it closely. I'm going to talk about Minding the Gap, Reflections on Legal Subjectivity in the Age of Globalization. And there's a growing debate, it seems, on the expansion of the range of legal subjects or legal persons. For example, in 2009 in Britain, a Radio 4 programme, Law in Action, took what it called an unusual look at the subject of legal rights, starting with reference to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and moving on to suggest the idea of granting rights to a wide range of putative beneficiaries, including animals, trees, and even robots, as the presenter put it. And I think these kind of questions are only going to become more important to law and legal theory as technology develops and as pressures grow in relation to environmental breakdown, climate change, and the growing sense that ecosystems and animal species are under enormous pressure. So I'm going to argue that in theorizing legal subjectivity, which is what we're going to have to do if we want to look at these issues of expanding the range of legal persons, that the backdrop of contemporary globalization, and in particular the dominance of the corporate legal subject, should, as a theoretical, ethical, and political matter, be made central to any reflection about expanding the range of legal subjects or legal persons. And that's the nub of my argument. We live in dangerous times, it seems. Our planet and we who inhabit it as human beings arguably face unprecedented existential threats. Climate change, environmental degradation, the eradication of entire species of flora and fauna, looming sets of ecosystem crises, these converge to produce a growing sense that the ravages visited upon the delicate balance of the Earth system could at this point even be irreversible. A recent report of the Scientific Study of the Oceans suggesting an imminent extinction of ocean life forms on a scale unseen since the mass extinction of the dinosaurs evokes implications darkly symbolic, laden with angst concerning whether or not we have, on a whole set of scales and areas, reached certain planetary tipping points from which there may be for us and for other species no return. Meanwhile, at the same time, and almost tracking this, we see a widening global rift between rich and poor and the seemingly relentless deepening of human vulnerability on a whole set of measures clearly linked by certain scholars to the dynamics of neoliberal globalization. It's also clear that globalization and its patterns of impoverishment and structural injustice closely mirror the differential impacts of climate change. It's the poorest societies, the poorest groups, and the poorest individuals who most lack the capacity and resilience to respond and adapt to environmental change and climate-driven natural disaster. Now, these patterns of deepening human and environmental vulnerability, of intensifying pressure, can be linked and have been linked to the theme of the ascendancy of global corporate power. Gill's identification of a market civilization as being a monoculture of both social development and mind that is associated with the political economy of disciplinary neoliberalism is richly implicated in many accounts of human rights abuses and environmental disasters. And there are multiple accounts linked to this of corporate involvement in the abuse and exploitation of both human beings, animals, and accounts of corporate devaluation and exploitation of the environment in the irresponsible pursuit of profit. Now, of course, that's not to argue that corporations are inherently destructive, but it is undeniable, as Joseph and Kindley point out, that for all their positive potential, the litany of corporate human rights abuses in both global north and global south are far from encouraging. And as Posthuman and Westra have both argued, the evidence of corporate environmental irresponsibility, predation, and worse is now incontrovertible. And I think that we arguably can and should place the growing vulnerability of animal and human populations and of the living systems that support them in direct relationship to the predominantly hegemonic ideological closure currently dominating the world order. And if not always in directly causal terms, although there are reasons enough to link them in causal terms, then as a deliberate political choice. And in political terms, this deliberate choice for me relates to an urgent need to challenge a current confluence between global corporate interests and what we can think of as the widespread global state capitulation to neoliberalism. Global corporate power, or what some have termed in broader terms as the corporate takeover of contemporary life, is not convincingly resisted by many states. Shamir suggests that scholars of the global economy, notwithstanding vigorous and complex disagreements concerning the complexities of globalization, are in complete agreement, regardless of their disciplinary, analytic, or ideological inclinations, on one fact, and that fact is the fact that global corporate rule is already here. And many states actively court transnational corporations in their interests, pursuing neoliberalism as their ideology of choice. And as Beck has pointed out, for states attempting to resist the strictures of neoliberalism, the strategic power of global capital to refuse investment operates as a mechanism in what he has termed a politics of side effect, which produces a form of domination, which Beck has argued, in which the political metapower of global capital is an insidious but decisive shift in the history of power. Transnational corporations are in some senses and cases as powerful as some nation states and have emerged as what Beck describes as private sector quasi-states. Meanwhile, for the poorest nations on earth, state compliance with the imperatives of neoliberalism is effectively mandated. International organisations such as the World Trade Organization and the World Bank, identified by some as being the midwives of the globalised neoliberal order, press conditionality packages on cash-strapped developing nations, ensuring their conformity, no matter how reluctant, to the imperatives of neoliberal globalism. In this context, the concept of national state sovereignty stands weakened, but in a highly selective way. State sovereignty is effectively hollowed out in ways that disadvantage the most powerless the most of all. Baxi argues that the end of the nation-state thematic that we so often hear in debates about globalization really only applies to the end of the redistributive state, marking, as he puts it, in some important ways, the end of processes and regimes of human rights-orientated redistributive governance practices in ways that convert the mandate of progressive realization of social, economic, and cultural rights of people into an ongoing, cruel hoax. Nation-states have been effectively reconstituted as porous to global capital, as open-bordered good host states. But at the same time, the discursive construction of anti-terror imperatives and the permanent state of exception in which we now live ensures that the same cannot be said of the hard edges of state sovereignty, which are felt with intensifying force by a state's own population. And the same can be said of all those vulnerable non-citizens whose living, opaque, tangible, vulnerable bodies press up against the policed and exclusory borders of the modern state, driven by the forces of climate change, privation, civil war, economic scarcity, the sheer difficulty in some cases of bare survival in a particular location or nation-state location. So in the light of all of that, it could be perhaps thought a little ironic that globalization is sometimes described as being accompanied by the global ascendancy of rights-based and human rights-based reasoning. The power of rights discourse means perhaps inevitably that those of us concerned to resist the deepening vulnerability of people, ecosystems, non-human animals and the environment turn to rights claims and to the idea of expanding legal subjectivity as a way of articulating the value of that which we feel it's important to protect. So many voices speaking as and for the excluded and the subaltern turn to human and legal rights discourse as part of an attempt to protect an expanding range of potential beneficiaries. And so we see increasing calls for the recognition of the legal subjectivity of animals and or standing for the environment and elements within it, to evoke Christopher Stone's memorable phraseology of should trees have standing. And at the same time, there's a growing interest among legal theorists and others in the legal subjectivity of post-human entities such as artificial intelligence, agents, intelligent agents, robots, and the like. Now that debate, as I've already suggested, is vitally important and likely to become more so. And I want to place it against the background that I just painted of the world situation under the imperatives of neoliberal globalization. Because my concern is, and this is where the whole mind the gap injunction comes in, that we need to face up to the challenge of the fact that there is a gap that exists and is likely to deepen between those we can think of as laws insiders and those we can think of as laws outsiders. And by insiders, I mean those included within the sort of depth commitments of neoliberal capitalism and law. And by outsiders, I mean those currently excluded from the interiority of neoliberal privilege. The insiders are those whose interests and even whose subjectivity emerge almost seamlessly from the interiority of a capitalist technoculture. And even when we construct new forms of legal subjectivity, this gap is going to continue to be important and may even become more so, because when we putatively expand the range of legal beneficiaries, if there's a gap that exists still reflecting the outsiders that are currently constituted by our legal arrangements, this gap is likely to become even more perilous, arguably, in certain complex ways. And so I want to sketch out what I mean by that gap for the purposes of my argument. Now, of course, we can argue that all categories and gaps are, in the final analysis, just a choice of closure, a way of demarcating more or less choices about the perception or the construction of elements or monads within an otherwise undifferentiated field. And I think it's important that while we need to acknowledge the valuable insights of postmodernism and posthumanism, we have to stress the urgency to the age in which we live of developing a legal theory fully responsive to the vulnerable complexity of embodied life, to biovitality and materiality, to the messy complexities of what I'm provisionally calling the living real. There's a sense in which law has for too long just been inadequate to the living real. And somehow it seems vital for legal theorists to find a way of theorizing legal subjectivity and legal personhood in a way that allows us to see the living real fully in juridical terms, and to allow it also to exceed the all too bloodless templates of liberal legal theory in a way that enables us to develop a jurisprudence and a related politics freshly responsive to the lived realities of ontic life and to their ethical demand. Now, one way of doing this, of course, is to focus upon vulnerability, to foreground embodiment and its intrinsic affectability as a central part of our legal and political theory, and thereby to offer a distinct move away from the existing foundations of liberal legal and political subjectivity, which rest upon the foundations of a relatively autonomous, relatively disembodied, relatively decontextualized, rationalistic actor, so central to liberal philosophy, jurisprudence, and law. And that, it seems to me, is important work related to the foundations of legal subjectivity and how they might be theorized. But it seems to me to be vital that we place our debates and philosophical puzzles concerning the extension of legal subjectivity not only on a new theoretical foundation responsive to embodied life and the complexity and excess of the living real, but firmly within an overarching context that places globalization and corporate social dominance firmly in view as an explicit component of the theoretical field of reflection. Because there's a linkage, it seems to me, between liberal legal subjectivity and the legal ascendancy of the corporate form. And it's vital for legal theorists, when thinking about extending legal subjectivity, to engage with its existing architectural and gravitational resonances, to trace out the tendons that with living mutating patterns and mechanisms link liberal legal constructs to the pulsing juridical organ represented by the globalized legal and economic order. In short, it seems to me that it would be politically and ethically irresponsible to theorize legal subjectivity without being alert to the continuities between the necropolitics of law's existing inclusions and exclusions and our theoretical inquiry. And in particular, I rather suspect that existing patterns of privilege, power and disempowerment will just map themselves more or less seamlessly onto new formulations of legal subjectivity. So how then do we identify and trace the liberal legal subject and its intimate relationship with contemporary corporate privilege? Surely this is relevant when we think about the idea of liberal legal subjectivity and the ways in which we're going to address the need for expansion. I think that one way, possibly the best way, I don't know, I'm a bit agnostic on that, but one way certainly is to trace out the linkages between the corporate form and the existing templates of legal subjectivity as they currently exist in the law. Now, fortunately for me, Nafeen has offered an analysis of the existing templates of the legal person or rights-bearing subject, and her analysis provides a useful tool or map or stepping off point for identifying the dominant construction of liberal legal subjectivity. Nafeen divides legal persons or subjects into three templates, which he calls P1, P2, and P3. Okay. P1 is a bare analytical construct. It's the legal person conceived of as nothing more than the formal capacity to attract legal relations. This is law's entity in the language of NECAM, not a person in any sense that ordinary language usage would reflect. It's simply a logical unit for the purposes of law as a system. P2 is the definition applied to the animate being, and that coheres around the concept of any reasonable creature in being, familiar language to us lawyers. And that template is linked to biological and metaphysical definitions of humanity. P2 is the quintessential construct evoked by Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example. P3 is the responsible subject, or the rational and therefore responsible human legal agent or subject, the classic contractor, the rational bearer of responsibility, the adult actor at the heart of contract and criminal law, also known perhaps as homo economicus, homo juridicus, the rational actor who acts for reasons. There's a lot we could say about P1 and P2, but I really want to focus on P3. Because it's in P3, I think, that we find the strongest links between the construct of the liberal legal person and the corporate form. This person is one who's identified as a mentally and legally competent human adult, choosing, will-exercising, discrete possessor of rights. Importantly, Nafeen points out that P3 is a bit similar to P1 insofar as it's a technical term whose meaning is interior to law as a system. And in P3 theories and P3 versions of the legal subject or person, we find the most explicit degree of ideological tilt towards the dominant form of liberal legal subjectivity and its exclusions. For, as Nafeen says, in P3, we have the rational and therefore responsible human agent or subject, this classic contractor, the individual held personally accountable for his civil and criminal actions. But importantly, this subject is also impossibly self-possessed and self-reliant, will-driven, clinically rational and individualistic. Certainly he is never pregnant, for this would threaten his physical integrity. Also, he is not to be thought of as a wife. And a range of critical accounts of this construct point out that it privileges the characteristics in general terms of the white, male, property-owning, hyper-rational individual, identified by a range of theorists as a product of classical Western liberal philosophy and intimately related to its private property construct. And this template, of course, has drawn incisive critique, has almost univocally been masked by theorists of various persuasions as the submerged, the hidden, the masked primary beneficiary of law in Western cultures. And that's a factor which alone gives P3 particular importance in discussions of the legal person. We should also note that P1, while it's this formal construct, tends to have to materialise, and when it does, it mostly materialises in the form of P3 because of the overwhelming ideological traction, if you like, of the suppositions informing law's construction of the human natural person in the form of P3. Now, I argue that P3 in complex and subtle ways tends to favour the dominance of the corporate form, because it's the corporate form which emerges as the quintessential disembodied, rationalistic, acquisitive cipher of liberal law. Now, the linkage between P3 and the corporation is hinted at very briefly in the following quote from Federman. Now, he's discussing the simultaneous construction in American law in 1886 of the criminal and the corporation as subjectivities. And the quote hints at the deeper ideological relationship, arguably, between P3 and capitalism. The corporation of 1886 represents the production of the normal understanding of the new American man, the bodily expression of male power, the individual self liberated from the constraints of the past and the molestations of society or state. It is now the construct of a well-placed, self-interested, enterprising group of persons willing to stake their lives and livelihoods for economic success. As such, the corporation meets the requirements of the balanced character, that psychological trait necessary and applied only to elite males, the emerging commercial economy of the late 19th century. So if the P3 conception is the quintessential legal actor, I argue that the corporation is, in a sense, that person writ large. And it's interesting to note that some theorists have argued that the natural, legal, human subject is, in fact, more fictitious in law than the corporate form, because we're not disembodied and we're not constructed in an ideal formation with the commitments of capitalism, but the corporation is complexly disembodied and the very personification of capital itself, as Neocleus has argued. And the implications of that are that this particular form of legal, dominant form of legal subjectivity quite naturally favours corporations and is, in a sense, much more difficult if read in this way as a dominant construct, a much more difficult template into which to fit the needs of animals and complex material ecosystemic concerns. And it's the corporation that most closely approximates the privileges within the liberal legal system, arguably. Turning to the question of posthuman legal subjectivities, it seems possible that posthuman legal entities such as artificial intelligences and robots can and will be conceived of as vulnerable when rights claims are made for them. And of course, we should admit, shouldn't we, that as a conceptual matter, vulnerability is not monolithic, and of course, corporations can be conceived of as vulnerable also. But there remains, nonetheless, despite those complexities, and I return to this idea of minding the gap, the vital need to construct a critical fault line attending putative new rights claimants, perhaps particularly posthuman rights claimants, and the excluded outsiders of law as they currently exist, which is where I'm returning to this central theme of placing reflections on legal subjectivity against the dominance of the corporation and the need to watch this gap between law's insiders and law's outsiders. Because it's, as I said, it's entirely possible that even when animals, the environment, and certain other constructs are given legal personhood or legal rights, there will still remain billions of immiserated human beings and other quintessential outsiders who are not rendered thereby more protected. The overarching context of globalization, I think, points inexorably towards the need to have our eye on this gap. And historically and contemporaneously, law's outsiders, according to a whole range of accounts, are all those predictable others who now disproportionately bear the cost of the order of capitalistic techno-rationality. And I'm talking, of course, about the global poor of all genders and races, women, children, other non-dominant humans, such as racially non-dominant groups, the disabled, who, along with animals and the environment itself, have long formed intrinsically problematic legal subjects within the liberal legal scheme. And it's those denizens of the living real who struggle most, who are the most excluded in uneven and complex ways, and not always as homogenous or monolithic groups. So when we begin to reflect on legal subjectivity and the case for its expansion, I think it's vital that we keep an eye on the gap and keep a vivid focus on the background of globalization and the related series of tragedies littering the history of the relationship between liberal law and capitalism. And it's essential because that's the very context in which our legal categories have done and will have to do their future work. That's the context in which people are starting to respond to say we need to expand legal subjectivity. And that's the context in which it's likely that many post-human or techno entities might share the advantages of the capitalist techno-economy, while many human beings, especially the most socioeconomically impoverished human beings, will remain constituted as its stubborn outsiders and in need of protection. There is, in fact, I think, a virtual guarantee of continuing and deepening outsider status. And this matter, I think, should be placed front and centre of any theoretical attempts to expand legal subjectivity. So it's in that light that I think it's very important to place debates that are emerging about legal subjectivity and new forms of legal subjectivity against this larger backdrop of contemporary globalization and the related excesses, both historical and contemporaneous, of the intimacy between law and capital. I think that is an incredibly important ethical and political task. And I want to finish in a kind of crazy way by reading a brief piece of imaginative prose that I wrote for a preface on a debate piece along these lines, because I'm hoping that the imaginative prose might leave a resonance of my concerns that the more sort of academic language might fail to leave. And the piece is called Terror's Predicament. Terror is spelled T-E-R-R-A and represents, of course, the Earth. Once upon a time, there was a planet, perfect green and eggshell blue. It hung, fragile and ancient, in the yawning firmament of space-time. On the planet's surface, a thin crust riding a molten sea, one species outreached all others, reaching for the vaulted heavens with an inventiveness that far outstripped its own moral insight. It took a river of time and thought, but after a slow start, the inventiveness of the Terrans built to an accelerating howl, driven by a complex current of exchanges and interplays too vast to trace. Now the seething world of terror has reached a crisis point threatening the very materiality of life itself. The planet teeters at the tipping point. The restless Terra North need for expansion has emptied out civilizations, constructing in their place vast edifices of thought and speech, action and endless taking, until the rest of planetary life succumbed to the shadow threat in which the terminus now lurks. For Terran chemicals have leached into the very fluids of the planetary body, crushing the great terrestrial lung and engorging its ventricles with the toxins that now seize every rhizomatic finger of Terra's sprawling vegetation. Against the gathering gloom of smoke-smeared skies, giants open sonorous, flashing throats to swallow the world whole. These creations of Terra North, once servants, now masters, and possessing characteristics that no Terran ultimately can, leap across Terra in the flicker of a sleepless eyelid, dismembering time and space, dominating everything that they are not. The great unsleeping eye, the ocular rulers of multiple spheres, the giants expand, crowned in neon, while in their shadows the least powerful Terrans dissolve. Terra, her biotic mysteries torn into mathematical shards, her warm, inaudible throb buried beneath ceaseless chattering media, lies ravaged, while the giants appear and disappear, assuming and discarding materiality at will. They slip instantaneously across borders and boundaries, exploiting porosity, but they divide terror with impenetrable walls through which no breathing thing can pass. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. George Hubbard?
Just wanted the distinction of the focus on corporations. I was thinking I might focus a little differently, because all a corporation really is a way of organizing a bunch of people to do stuff together. And
Yeah.
it could be one person, doesn't mean to be a bunch of people. We're setting up a corporation-like thing for my wife to teach her voice lessons at home, and
Yeah,
I don't think she's being evil by being a corporate-like thing. So maybe it's just the idea is the dangers of when you have large groups of people doing stuff together, they can do bad things, and but it can be a partnership, or there's lots of other. So I can see how if standing was given to trees and fish, which might be a good idea, they could form a corporation themselves and gain power that way to act together. So I would think more of the focus on just the powers of governments can do bad things because it's a group of people doing things badly. Corporations can do bad things, but they can also, governments and corporations can do good things too.
Absolutely, and I think I made that quite clear when I said that corporations aren't inherently evil. And I think it's very important to bear in mind that, of course, they have lots of positive potential. And I wouldn't want to be heard to say that corporations are evil. I mean, the main focus of my concern is on transnational corporate forms, and particularly the advantage that corporations have within the strictures of neoliberal globalization and the commitments feeding that. But I think it's also important to remember that the corporation is more than just a bunch of people doing stuff together. We do erect an entity in law that has immortality, and we erect a veil precisely to protect the people from behind the corporate veil being held accountable for certain wrongs. And so I think it's very important to take our own jural constructs seriously. If we just dissolve the corporation and say that's just an idiom for a bunch of people doing things, certainly it is that, but it's more than that, then we fall, I think, into the problem of the group theory of the corporate form, which fails to account for the very real significance of the corporate veil and the fact that the group theory has been rejected repeatedly precisely because of the issue of the corporate veil. And I don't think people would spend so much time trying to pierce the corporate veil if all we were looking at was a group of people doing stuff together. So I think I accept what you're saying. Corporations are not inherently evil, and of course the corporation's soul can be one human being hidden behind a corporate veil of a one-man corporation, as was established in the case of Salomon and Salomon. But I think it's very important that we take our own jural construct seriously, and it's behind the veil of juridical personality, arguably, that corporations have taken the advantages they've got. So we absolutely have to engage with that analytically and not dissolve it in the way that your question implies we might.
I don't disagree with you at all about your idea about globalization. I think our culture today is starting to recognize that. The first thing that came to mind when you were talking about your terror was the movie, that little animated thing called WALL-E. If you see WALL-E,
I haven't seen WALL-E, no.
It's the same idea that globalization or large corporations have taken over pretty much the way we decide things. I guess I'm trying to decide whether or not you really think that courts, or courts as you constitute them, possibly these international courts, are going to be able to resist or this new way of thinking about legal status is going to somehow empower them. Because what I see is power in the economics and the economic power that comes from globalization that just kind of overwhelms. I agree with you about it. I see what goes on in the United States. You see what goes on around the world, and you say to yourself, where is there any restraint to this? I mean, where is it coming from? I'm not sure the courts, we've never done a very good job of protecting.
I agree with you entirely. And
I don't know where it's coming from. I'm curious as to what you would think. How would we counter this?
Well, I don't know that there's any straightforward answer to that. I certainly don't think law is necessarily the answer. I think law is part of the problem, and that's kind of implicit in the critical element of what I've been saying about the construction of legal subjectivity. But we do have to address law both critically and reconstructively because it's such a dominant mode of social organisation. It has so much power, so we have to address it, but I don't think it is the sole answer, because there are many ways in which law is already discursively colonised, even international human rights law, which traditionally has been my main area of theoretical inquiry. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights paradigm has already been re-rendered as a trade-related, market-friendly conception.
The world trade, the free trade agreements and all those things
absolutely,
that are going on,
yeah,
being used against the poor people in the various countries like Mexico and places like that, where we were sold that was going to help in increase trade, and everything what it's done is make it boring.
Yeah, it's a deeply tilted set of power relationships. I think we do, as lawyers, we have to address it at theoretical and practical levels, but I think the law is a limited tool in the sense that it is already deeply ambivalent, to say the least, in relation to these problems. But given that it is one site of power, I do think we have to engage with it, including in terms that it understands within its own interior rationalities. But I think we have to find creative ways of going beyond the law. So we need to look at things like, I mean, a colleague of mine is trying to construct an argument for the ways in which shareholders might reconstitute the internal structure of the corporate form to make it more responsive. As consumers, we have avenues, although one would want to resist the reductive characterization of human beings as consumers. But you can see that by reticulating with the discursive constructions of capitalism, we can find modes of resistance. But I think it's going to be enormously difficult, particularly because the state, coming back to your point, the state is so thoroughly involved and implicated in these patterns. The vast majority of states in the global north support neoliberal agendas, set up unjust arrangements through the World Bank and the IMF, and force conditionality packages on nations in the global south. So, you know, it's an open question of, you know, where do we turn? I honestly don't know, and that's why my paper is admittedly a bit dystopian, because I guess at the end of the day I feel a bit bleak about it, to be honest. I don't know how we can turn back the tide. All I know is that I'm going to die trying.
Right on.
I thought it was intriguing what you were talking. I sort of discerned a sub-paper in what you were doing. It seems you definitely had the theme that recognizing new rights is not a cure-all, because if there are already people who have rights but you still care about them, then I'm not sure whether you were saying that recognizing those rights might not help these people, or maybe even you were saying that recognizing those rights might hurt these people. And that's a theme that that we see in a lot of places. Even from, one can reject the overall thrust of your paper, for example, the critique of neoliberalism, globalization, corporations, and so on. And there are many perspectives where people would take a similar view that extending the province of rights is not necessarily good, because, among other things, like maybe those people in themselves might not deserve the rights. Like, you know, you might suggest giving rights to this can of Coke, but I would say, no, this can of Coke does not deserve any rights, so on its own merits. But then you might say, well, if you recognize these rights, you might hurt other people who really do have rights who we really care about. So, for instance, Marx, who I suppose we wouldn't characterize as a booster of neoliberalism, but he waxed eloquent over the accomplishments of capitalism and its transformative potential, and how it broke down feudalism and other things like that. It was not particularly environmentally caring. I mean, there are a lot of people who are Marxist and who think that, you know, giving rights to the environment is bad because it actually hurts the poor, because, you know, even if we had a socialist state, you might want to do things that are destructive of the environment to help poor people. Or for example, let's take the views from a very different moral mindset. During the time of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States, you had many people who favored the subjugation of black people, who were the poor whites, because they recognize that if you give rights to slaves, or if you give rights to if you give more rights to free blacks, then they are more effective. They're more effective competitors to the poor whites.
So is there a question in there?
Well, I was just sort of thinking that is what you're saying about the extension of rights to new things being potentially in tension with the current rights that you want to support. It seems that it doesn't depend on what you're saying about, it's independent of what you're saying about corporations and globalization and neoliberalism. Is that right?
Well, it can be, of course, and I'm choosing at this particular point not to make it independent of it. And I'm not necessarily, I'm actually agnostic on the idea of extending rights, by the way. It's just that this debate is happening, and I think I want to engage it. So my position is fundamentally more agnostic than perhaps I've portrayed. I think this is a very, very interesting technical question. It's inordinately complex. So the minute you start talking about rights, we're talking about moral rights, we're talking about legal rights. Often, particularly in the human rights context, the two get completely blurred and introduce all sorts of tensions between what I would say is the power of human rights discursivity, which is this idea of a reaching for a justice yet to come, a teleological kind of reaching beyond the closures of the status quo, and human rights as positive law, in which case in that realm, it seems as though positivized human rights drift further and further away from their critical humanitarian energy into something much more technicistic, rationalistic, and able to be exploited even by corporations who the average layperson in the street will go, hang on, that doesn't make sense because the corporation is not a human being. But in law, it makes perfect sense. So I'm interested in all these puzzles. I don't accept the argument, however, that by granting rights to, say, animals, we diminish rights in human beings. I just don't think it works that way. But I think we need to look very carefully at what we need to define our terms. What are we talking about when we're talking about rights? And are we giving rights because it's in our interest to give rights, or the interest of the entity itself? And the question, as you rightly say, of whether or not giving rights to something would diminish the protection of other things, or whether not giving rights to those things would also diminish the protection of other things. So, people who want to argue against giving other entities rights, that's exactly the same kind of argument that you hear in, gay relationships shouldn't be recognised because it's going to damage marriage. We have to be very critical about all those things. What I would say is that in engaging in this whole debate, questions of power have to be central, to come back to your point, time and time again. Because every time we create these constructions, and the more that we treat them as autonomous technical constructions that are the results of some pure rationality, the more I suspect there are cloaked questions of power in play. So I'm fundamentally agnostic on your point.
Okay, so I think that gets at my confusion, because I thought you were taking a position on whether rights ought to be extended to the environment and so on.
No, I'm agnostic.
But you're not.
I
You're
haven't,
just saying
no.
that however you come out of that, you ought to think about it with a consciousness.
What I'm saying is there's a debate out there about that happening. And if we're going to have a theory of legal subjectivity, which is remotely relevant to the complex socio-material world in which we live, that theory of legal subjectivity needs to engage with those debates in the context in which they're occurring, which for me is the inescapable overriding context of the situation that the planet and the human species as inhabitants of that planet face in terms of globalization, climate change, climate injustice, and all the, what I would say are growing trends towards a division between the empowered and the disempowered. And it's vital that theorists get involved in that debate, because I think we need to make sure that our theory more closely maps itself in a responsive way onto the underlying vulnerabilities at play in what I think of as the living real or the ontic dimension, and that anything else to me would be like a form of theoretical or ethical irresponsibility. That's my position.
So I guess I'll jump in the queue. I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit more color for those of us that are not sort of steeped in the literature about what this looks like when it happens. So I take it following Sasha's point that when we think about, we face these kinds of legal questions about how to define these categories all the time. Those types of decisions have implications for redistribution, for power. That all makes sense to me. but I guess I don't have a good sense of what the alternative is. So I think what you're doing is warning against not thinking about these types of power implications. So what's the alternative? Is it some sort of neutral kind of legal reasoning that is insensitive to these kinds of power dynamics? And what does that look like? And can you give us an example that might provide us a little bit of color about how that can happen sort of unthinkingly when you don't think about these power dynamics, but we really should because they have these kinds of negative implications?
That's a really interesting question. I suppose the obvious area for me to respond to that from would be the developments in human rights law towards human rights for corporations. I mean, that's an area where technical legal reasoning about persons has been deployed to give corporate human rights, in effect. So in the European Convention of Human Rights, a corporation was given an Article 8.1 right to respect for its home as a right to stay in its office. Okay? Now, for a lot of people, that's really jarring because the right to respect for a home is about a home as a mode of protection for your embodied life, your private relational context, etc. It shouldn't be about, you know, a corporation having a right to its office. So that's one example. But the result of that is that within technical legal reasoning, the way judicial reasoning works, as we all know, is that a precedent is established, and then that precedent becomes almost like a form of closure that is then interpreted and questioned after that. And this is the point I was trying to make about when you see human rights move towards technical juridical reasoning and away from the humanitarian critical energy on which they're arguably birthed in the post-Second World War settlements around human rights, international human rights in particular I'm thinking of, we see these kind of closures. Now, at the level of power, that might not seem too significant within the context of the ECHR. I mean, the ECHR exists anyway within a context that was about setting up a capitalist European order in the post-war context to produce a new economic and political harmony between European states. But when that kind of reasoning gets extrapolated out into the broader drafts of international human rights discursivity, we see some very negative effects, as Baxi has argued. So in relation to the right to food, that's largely become the right of three large agribusinesses to control world food supplies. The right to health becomes the right of IP companies to hold IP monopolies on pharmaceutical formulas, etc., etc. And so at that level, you start to see a discursive distortion, which results, as Baxi makes very clear in his excellent work, The Future of Human Rights, it means that the rights for capital become almost conceptualized as a precondition for the satisfaction of human rights standards. And that, I think, is a dangerous development, because if you then constitute large corporate conglomerates as some kind of discursive insider to international human rights, the question then becomes, where is the distinctive ground upon which to defend vulnerable human beings and communities from these actors who are now insiders to that discursive structure? So that's the best example I can think of at this point in time to answer your question. I hope it answers it.
Sasha?
Actually, following up, sorry to be back so soon, following up on what you were answering to Michael. So this is making me think, is the structure of your argument really any different than what I think of as many common arguments against, arguments about whether a particular right exists? For example, we all like free speech, but you might argue that, well, free speech should not be taken to extend to hate speech because it has a bad effect on minority communities. Or free speech should not be taken to extend to anyone's right to buy whatever advertising you like before an election because that undermines the working of democracy, which has an effect on different rights. So that way of thinking is how I imagine people talking about rights not in a disembodied form, but with a consciousness of what power relations are, and thinking, well, is recognizing this right going to have a good effect on power relations or a bad effect on power relations? So is your thesis basically part of that category of argument?
Not really. For a start, I think rights are inherently conceptually slippery categories, so I wouldn't want to fix the meaning of any right at any particular point. And also there's one distinction between the questions you've posed it, which is about the interpretive extension of existing rights and what they actually mean. Whereas what I'm looking at is the idea of which entities can claim which categories of rights. And traditionally, my concern has been about what I would say is the misappropriation of human rights by corporate entities, which raises rather different questions and is a rather distinct field of inquiry from what you've set up in your question.
Broad, because I think the same people who make the arguments I just said would also say, well, let's consider this all new form of corporation. What kind of rights should the corporation have? And then they might say, well, we shouldn't give X, Y, and Z rights to the corporation.
Sure, they might make the arguments, but they're rather different. The same people can make different arguments. I would still maintain that the arguments are not entirely the same, although they're related. One is about the interpretive extension of existing rights and the point at which they are interpretively limited. To take your example, the hate speech example, and the other is about which entities can claim which categories of rights. Now, the same people might make the same arguments, but they are conceptually distinct and distinguishable categories of concern.
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking of it as being the same in the sense that the way I think about all of these arguments are, should entity A be able to take action B? So any question can be just infinitely subdivided like that. So if it's a question of whether the right to free speech of a person covers more things, or whether the same action can be done by more people, but I mean, I think that the basic thing I'm getting at is whichever way you go at it, their view is you should take into account the effect of that on power relations, and that you shouldn't talk about that unless you have a view on what the power relations are and whether that makes people better or worse off under some way of thinking. That sounds like you saying that if you're considering whether corporations should have rights, for example, think about whether it makes people better or worse off, or whether it exacerbates bad things about neoliberalism or that sort of thing. Is that fair?
Well, I think it's kind of fundamentally irresponsible to theorize questions without looking at their effects in the real world. You know, insofar as we can separate the real world from the legal world, and that's a question in and of itself. But I certainly think it would be irresponsible not to pay attention to the constitutive effects of our legal categories on the way that we live, because law is intrinsically a form of social coordination, authoritative institutional social coordination. The point of law is to affect the world. And it's kind of ironic that law deploys so many categories that are thought of as if they were somehow hermetically sealed from the living world, when actually the entire purpose, it seems to me, of law and juridical categories is precisely to affect relations in the world. And I rather suspect that that is in and of itself a reflection of the way that law falls out in relation to power. I mean, there's some very interesting theories about that. I'm thinking in particular of Alan Norrie's work in Britain on the construction of the juridical individual in the 19th century, at the point at which the English criminal law was redesigned, structurally redesigned, specifically in its socio-historical context to privilege the emergent rights of a then arising capitalist class. So I think whenever we have a kind of protestation that somehow we're dealing with a pure legal category, I think we can pretty much suss that there will be some hidden power element involved in that very protestation. But I think rights are an extraordinarily complex and interesting field of inquiry. And to come back to your point about should entity A have capacity B, I mean, really, rights are just a particular tool that we use, a different way of saying things. In some cultures, you know, they talk about dignity, for example, in ways other than using rights. You can talk about vulnerability in ways other than using rights. There's a difference between what we think of as moral rights, which are, again, just a claim about what matters to whom and why, and legal rights, which we can think of as an inherently more plastic, something closer to a technical device of law, but never completely closed in law, because those questions of power are, I think, inescapable. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Okay, so I think that closes our summer and this workshop, and I want to
Thank you.